As a quorum is present, the Subcommittee on Elections will come to order. Members will take their attendance on the roll. All right, we've got a busy docket, so we're going to get started, and we're going to start with 4 bills on the no excuse absentee voting. And before we bring Delegate Herring up to speak, the first thing we're going to do is incorporate House Bills 25, 208, and 209 into House Bill 1. Do I have a motion to do so?
So moved.
And a second? All those in favor for incorporating House Bills 25, 208, and 209 into House Bill 1 will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes. Delegate Herring?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm here on HB 1. This bill removes the excuse requirement for casting an absentee ballot 45 days before an election, and it removes all references to excuses from the code and the voting section, the section of the code. As you all may remember, in 2019, we did pass a bill for no excuse needed for 2 weeks before the election. And as I said earlier, it takes it to 45 days. Virginia is one of only 18 states that still requires an excuse to be provided. So we'll be joining other states and not now being a minority of states that still requires an excuse to be provided. As you all can see by the code, there are numerous reasons, and I think it's time to remove them. People are being required to put personal information out there in the ether about why they want to vote absentee, and I think it's time that we just remove that restriction. So basically, that's the substance of the bill. But I do believe, Mr. Chair, I should have spoken about the amendments that we do have before I presented the bill. Sorry about that.
Council, will you report the amendments?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Herring, we have a number of technical line amendments. Most of these were done to the corresponding Senate bill as well at the request of either the department or the Attorney General's office, but they are largely technical. On line 112, after section 24.2-452, we'll insert who has applied for an absentee ballot pursuant to 24.2-701. On line 164, we'll strike the reference to the state board and replace that with the department. On line 166, we'll strike the reference to State Board and insert Department. On line 169, we're going to update a cross-reference to include 24.2-703.1. On line 197, we'll strike a reference to State Board and replace with Department. On line 206, after the first instance of application, we'll strike prescribed pursuant to 52 U.S.C. Code 20302, subsection B2, and then insert as defined in 24.2-452. On line 268, we'll insert at the end of that sentence, in the case of a special election, excluding for federal offices, if time is insufficient between the issuance of the writ calling for the special election and the date of the special election, absentee voting in person shall be available as soon as possible after the issuance of the writ. And then on line 294, at the end of the sentence that ends with registrar, we'll insert a new sentence. Such location shall be deemed the equivalent of the office of the general registrar for purposes of completing the application for an absentee ballot in person pursuant to sections 24.2-701 and 24.2-706.
Is there a motion to move the amendments? So moved. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, nay. The amendments pass. Are there any questions of the bill as amended for the patron? Delegate Cole.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, when we've had this bill, these type of bills in the past, the registrars have always told me that they need additional funding to implement it. They may need to hire additional staff and get additional voting machines. And I'm just wondering if they have approached you about that, and if there's a budget amendment for them to help fund implementation of this.
Mr. Chair, I can respond that they have not approached me about that. I believe, though, that, this is one of the governor's priorities, and I would expect that there would be appropriation for that. But there has been no concern expressed to me by the registrars or my office.
Any other questions? Is there anybody here to speak in favor of the bill? And if we can keep our remarks short, since it seems like there's a lot of us, and we have
I'll keep it very short. I'm Barbara Tabb. I'm the president of the Electoral Board Association of Virginia. As all of you know, we're the people who are tasked with actually executing these elections. The registrars may not have talked with anyone. We don't have a position on this other than to follow up. We need funding for this. If you all want this to be done, we have to have funding. I will tell you that Senator Deeds has put a $5 million budget amendment in. There was no money to fund this, as I understand it, in the governor's budget, but the senator does have, he told me day before yesterday, Friday, that he has put money in for this. We need that, as to say, we don't have a position on this as a good thing or a bad thing, but we do need funding if we're going to execute it.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jessica Bowman, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Elections. Want to thank the patron and everyone who's done work on this over the years. It's been a long time coming, and the governor supports the bill.
Delegate Cole. Ask for a question. Go ahead, Delegate Cole.
If the governor supports it, how come he didn't include money to implement it in his budget?
So he included registrar and electoral board reimbursement at 100%, which has not been done in a very long time. So that should free up money in localities that they're currently spending to meet the mandate in the budget for registrar salaries to spend as they see fit.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Anna Scholl with Progress Virginia. We strongly support the proposal. We believe that Virginians should be able to vote regardless of whether they work on a Tuesday, they have childcare on a Tuesday, they get caught in traffic on a Tuesday. We think this is a great step forward for the Commonwealth and ask you to support the bill.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Robin Lynn, Secretary of the Goochland County Electoral Board. I speak on behalf of my board, and perhaps the distinguished gentleman from Spotsylvania will remember a member of the Virginia Electoral Board Association, the late Elvira Shaw, who served for more than half a century as the secretary in Colonial Heights, pointed out to this committee on numerous occasions that the association was formed, and the chief reason was to pursue this issue, to eliminate the requirements for absentee voting. And I would support this bill wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Tram Nguyen, Co-Executive Director of New Virginia Majority. We have supported this measure for years, and so this morning I enthusiastically ask for your support for HB1. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Carol Nago with the League of Women Voters. And we have been very keen for no absentee voting. We don't believe anyone should have to have an excuse to vote. And so we sincerely support this bill.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Lisa Steib with Virginia Education Association, and we also support the bill.
Is there anybody that would like to speak in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, Eric Fly, not necessarily speaking in opposition to the bill, but did want to bring to your attention, our company is a lobbying and marketing company. February 1 of 2019, a private investment firm approached us anticipating this bill coming and anticipating this bill passing. They asked us to develop a marketing plan on how absentee ballots could be harvested, how the voting process as it relates to absentee ballots could be commercialized and money could be made off of it. So what I would encourage you to do as you look at passing this bill is to look at the unintended consequences in what you're doing. This basically, by removing the restrictions on the absentee ballot, creates a private market for private companies to harvest absentee ballots just like we would harvest corn. They would use all sorts of marketing tactics. Those that would be targeted would be the senior citizens and the poor. And it would basically create an opportunity to make profits out of harvesting the absentee ballots because the market becomes very large when you do away with the restrictions. I'm not saying you shouldn't do away with the restrictions. What I'm saying is possibly you might want to think about restricting these private companies from coming in and harvesting these ballots, because what you'll have is a total harassment of the voters. This market, once you remove the restrictions, will be $141 million market per year. So the money is there to create a market and to invest the money to harvest these absentee ballots. And I believe that with the unintended consequences, you're going to actually hurt the people that you're trying to protect. Our company refunded the money to the investors that asked us to do the marketing plan. We did not release the marketing plan because we believe that without the restrictions on these private companies and political parties and other entities, the harvesting of these absentee ballots is dangerous to the Commonwealth. And would ask you to look at putting restrictions on these third-party companies that will make huge profits on the backs of those who need to vote absentee. And I would ask you to consider that. Thank you, sir.
Delegate Bloxham.
Question for the speaker. So what suggestions would you have to if this bill moves forward, to prevent, are there amendments to keep private companies from harvesting votes so that we could draft legislation so we would protect ourselves from that, but allow people to vote on their own?
Yes.
Absentee?
Mr. Chairman, to answer the delegate's question, I believe there could be amendments placed on the bill, remove the restrictions that seems to be desirable, and there could be restrictions put in the bill that would prohibit private companies, third-party companies, from being able to harvest these votes or being able to make contact with those who are eligible for absentee voting. I believe there's restrictions that could be placed in the legislation that would also restrict political parties, individuals related or affiliated with different elections or campaigns, to restrict them from being able to harvest these votes. So I think if we sit down, we can work through this so that we can remove the restrictions, which is the will of the House, but also prevent these basically vipers from coming in and abusing, because what you're going to create is a situation where if you dislike robocalls on your cell phone now you're going to have it in your absentee voting, basically. And I created the marketing plan, so I know how it works, and it will work. And it will harvest a lot of votes, whoever's willing to pay. And we figure each vote's worth about $60. So when you multiply that times a couple of million people, it's quite a big market. But yes, to answer the question, there are ways to restrict it, I believe. Your attorneys would have to work on it, but I believe there's ways to restrict private companies from coming in.
Delegate Sickles.
Thank you for coming today. We'd be more than welcome to see your language. I would like to see a definition, a code of harvesting. What do you think harvesting is, and what is how would you restrict political parties as an outside entity in, quote, harvesting, unquote?
I think most political parties probably don't have the staffing to do it themselves, so they would go to the third-party companies to harvest. Harvesting basically is the going out and recruiting those or capturing those votes, those absentee ballots. Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, there's a little bit of difference between campaigning and hiring third-party companies to
Bring us language to
base
that
I can-
difference between campaigning and harvesting.
I'd be glad to
And
bring
what
that.
kind of laws you'd prefer. And that's all I have to say, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to do so.
Right. This committee moves on motions.
Mr. Chairman, I move to report this bill.
There's been a motion to report House Bill 1. The motion was properly seconded. Members will record their vote on the electronic voting system.
Thank you. I'll wait.
Thank you, Delegate Herring. Delegate Krizak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. The bill I have before you is HB 220, which requires the envelope provided to an absentee voter for the return of a mail-in absentee ballot includes prepaid postage. For many citizens, emails and texts have replaced letters. I know it's kind of scary out there, but it's a whole new world. Bills are paid online. Fewer people, especially young people, even know what a stamp is, frankly. I know my daughter asked me what to do when she was trying to vote. And I said, you got to go to a post office. So anyway, obtaining this postage to return a mail-in ballot is really a barrier for the elderly and those with limited access to transportation, and certainly college students. But it's really more of a symbolic thing. I mean, there should be no cost to vote. There should be no fee, there should be no tax, there should be no stamp payment to vote. 16 states have already implemented prepaid postage for return envelopes for absentee voting, and we should be the 17th. This proposal would use the U.S. Postal Service's BRM, the business reply mail, so localities would only pay for those ballots that actually get returned. And if you put a stamp on if you do put a stamp on it, that gets credited back to you, so we wouldn't pay for those. In 2019, I did a little analysis of how much this would cost. 37% of the absentee votes were cast by mail. The rest of the absentees were in person. If the no excuse ballots and postage paid envelopes expand the use of the mail-back ballots, that percentage may be partially offset, actually more than offset, if we go to expansion of 45 days of early in-person absentee voting. So 37% is probably your high watermark. Could go down. This bill has the support of the Postal Service and the National Association of Letter Carriers. I sent you all a letter yesterday, I think, to your office from them. So anyway, it's really a small fix, and it's not a very expensive one, and I can tell you how much I've got the cost for all of your all's jurisdictions. The biggest one really is Delegate Sickles, Fairfax County, of course. And if we look at last year, it would have cost about $15,380. That's it. Hope you'll pass it.
Any questions from the members of the committee? Is there anybody here to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Scoble from Unite Virginia in support of the bill. We agree with the delegate that this is a good bill, and a stamp should never be an obstacle in casting your vote. and we believe that it's a larger concern for students and people who may have limited opportunities to purchase stamps due to location payment methods or hours of retail locations that sell stamps. So we ask that you support this bill. Thank you.
Anyone in opposition?
I'm Barbara Tabb with the Electoral Board Association. I'm not in opposition. It's the same statement that I made before. $15,000 may not seem a lot to you, but if we require the localities to even add $15,000 or $1,000 in a lot of localities with the other expenses that we're looking for this year, it's going to be a really difficult thing. We ask if you're going to approve this, please fund this at the same time.
Good morning. Kirk Showalter, City of Richmond General Registrar representing the voter registrars. We have the same concerns as Ms. Tabb expressed. Our data, at least the data that I've been looking at for no excuse through the mail, indicates that there will actually be an expansion of the use of absentee through the mail. If the state would like to have the cost revert to itself, we're happy to do that, but there would be an impact on the localities.
Delegate Cole.
Have you put a budget amendment in on this?
This is not a state expense. It's to, as they mentioned, it goes to localities. For you, for example, Spotsylvania would pay about $1,090.
Move to report. We work on motions.
Mr. Chairman, I move to report the bill.
Is there a second?
I have a substitute motion to report and refer to appropriations.
Second. There's been a substitute motion to report and refer to appropriations on House Bill 220. The motion was properly seconded. Members will record their vote on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. That bill will report and refer to appropriations on a 6-0 vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Delegate Tran. And before we get to Delegate Tran's bill, we need a motion to incorporate House Bill 191 into Delegate Tran's 203.
So moved.
Second? So there's been a motion to incorporate House Bill 191 into House Bill 203. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, that motion carries. So Delegate Tran.
Good morning. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for your time to discuss House Bill 203. This bill is a top legislative priority for Virginia's Joint Leadership Council. The council is comprised of veterans service organizations, and its mission is to provide advice and assistance to the governor, General Assembly, and our Department of Veterans Services. This bill allows our overseas service members who are active duty, who are doing their jobs on the front lines protecting our democracy, some additional time to participate in our democracy. It allows the Board of Elections to count their ballots if they are postmarked by Election Day and received by 5 p.m. 2 business days before the board meets to certify the results of the election. I know you're trying to balance the reality that life happens and how can we give our overseas military members, and indeed all voters, extra time to return their absentee ballots and be counted, with the understandable need to conclude the democratic process by counting all ballots, calling a winner, and if needed, beginning the transition of power in a timely manner. Some have asked me, is this really about getting overseas service members and all voters to change their behaviors and essentially become better voters, request that ballot earlier, complete it as soon as possible, and return it on time? And it's 2020. The Postal Service across the globe is much more sophisticated. Why can't our overseas service members plan out in advance how long it would take to return a ballot through international mail or military mail, and then request and vote accordingly, request the ballot and vote accordingly? After all, these are adults who have serious and sophisticated responsibilities. So I just want to take a look at who's overseas, where they are, some of the issues that they may face in returning their ballots. According to the latest figures from the Department of Defense's Defense Manpower Data Center, there are about 174,000 active duty service members overseas, not including those in combat zones. They serve in countries ranging from Afghanistan and Iraq to Guatemala and Japan. While some of these countries have a strong postal service, others' systems are still far from what we know here in the United States. The U.S. Postal Service says, in terms of doing military mail, transit times vary depending on operational conditions and the unit that the service member is located in. Those in established bases should continue to receive regular services, but those in forward bases or engaged in operations may experience longer arrival times due to logistical constraints. This can probably be said the same for sending mail from those bases back to the U.S. As a barometer, it's estimated that it would take 7 to 9 days for mail to arrive to service members in Germany, 8 to 10 days to arrive in Japan and Korea, 11 to 13 days to Iraq and Afghanistan, and 15 to 18 days to reach service members in Africa. In addition to mail time, there are other aspects of military duties that may make it more complicated to return an absentee ballot. Take my brother, for example. He's an active duty officer in the Marine Corps. He completed 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. In those deployments, there were times where he was on base, reachable by phone and email, and got mail. There were also many, many times when he was conducting missions in the field, and we simply could not hear from him for weeks. He couldn't use the phone, didn't have internet, didn't have the ability to request or send mail, let alone an absentee ballot. He was also stationed in Okinawa for several years. While there, he completed a 7-week training mission in the Philippines and a 5-week training mission in Thailand. Both times, he was completely off the grid and inaccessible. For those missions, he didn't have a whole lot of notice to be able to plan for anything in advance, just told to pack his bags and go. My cousin is an active duty officer in the U.S. Navy. She served on a tour on an aircraft carrier as well as other ships in the naval fleet. Those times when she was at sea, she was unable to send physical mail unless she was in port, and she had absolutely no control over when she would be in port. Sometimes, if her ship didn't make it to port and they were near one, then perhaps a military plane could pick up the mail that had been forwarded to the port and fly it out to the ship, but only if it was a ship the plane could land on. And then they'd send the mail back through the plane back to port to get forwarded on. These are just some of my family's experiences, but I think they help to illustrate the unique challenges that our overseas military service members may face in returning their absentee ballots, even with the best of planning and intentions and the most sophisticated of postal services. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Are there any questions from the committee? Is anybody here that would like to speak in favor of the bill?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Carrie Ann Alford. I am the Director of Policy and Planning for the Department of Veterans Services. I'm also the staff administrator for the Joint Leadership Council. The department has no position on this bill, but this is a top priority of the JLC. As some of you may remember, you've been around for as long as I have. You know that many years the JLC spent trying to get not only their UOCAVA ballot sent electronically, but also returned electronically with the CAT card. For the last year and a half, given all of the stuff that is going on in Washington, D.C. at the national level with cybersecurity concerns in other countries, we decided that this was a reasonable option to explore. And we've been working with Senator Survell, who put the bill in 2 years ago at the request of the McAuliffe administration, to really make sure that we had this done in the correct way. The service member must still have the absentee ballot postmarked on or before Election Day, and it must reach the registrar in time to be counted. The original bill does say 2 days before the board meets to certify elections. I can let you know, if you hadn't heard, the Senate amended that to 4 days at the request of the registrars, and the council is perfectly fine with that. I'm happy to answer any technical questions you may have.
Delegate Sickles, Mr. Chair, there isn't a line amendment for this bill, but we did amend the companion Senate bill to say the 4th business day instead of the 2nd business day.
Good morning. Again, Kirk Showalter, General Registrar for the City of Richmond, representing the voter registrars. We are supportive of this bill, but would appreciate the amendment from 2 days to 4 days, business days, to give electoral boards sufficient time to process, especially with the expansion of absentee voting through the mail. We appreciate that you limited it to UOCAVA voters as well, rather than all voters. I do have one question, and I apologize for not having looked at this before I came. Is this just limited to overseas UOCAVA voters or all UOCAVA voters? Because we do have military stateside that would not encounter those same problems as overseas voters.
Overseas is the answer, but wait one sec, Delegate Sickles.
Just had a question. So I know you have a deadline for provisionals on noon of Friday.
Yes,
How many days after that would this 4-day deadline be? When are you talking about?
Well, as I'm reading this bill, it would be 4 days before the electoral board, well, under the way that's written, 2 days before the State Board of Elections certifies ballots, which is about 2 to 3 weeks generally after the election. It's not tied to the electoral board's certification.
Mr. Chairman, but you oppose that and you have another alternative. You have a 4-day, is that the same as the 4 days or the?
It's just shifting it from 2 days before the State Board of Elections certifies the elections to 4 business days.
So
Yes, sir.
how many, excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Sickles.
How many days after that Friday is that?
It varies. It could be as much as 3 weeks. It could be as much as 2 weeks. Yes, sir. The State Board typically certifies the elections after the local electoral boards have certified the elections.
Mr. Chairman, so just to be clear, this, I'm just focusing on that this is not your local electoral board. This is the state electoral board that is going to have to wait. We have a really close election. We're going to have to wait 3 weeks for mail to come in from overseas under this bill.
It is my understanding that is the case.
Delegate Price.
And this can be for any of the speakers that would have the answer. About how many votes are we talking about? And if we're going to extend it that long, just wondering, because I do live right beside the 94th district where it came down to a difference of 1 vote. And so just wondering what that would do, I think, likened to what Delegate Sickles may have been, how could this negatively impact elections from being decided on a timely basis?
Well, ma'am, it just, if I had a crystal ball, I could give you an exact count, but my guess is that it would be limited. Under current law, UOCAVA voters, we have to send them that have applications in before Election Day, before the start date of absentee. We have to send them on the 45th day, and the vast majority of the UOCAVA voters do get sent out the 45th day, so I imagine it would be very few who could not return it in time for Election Day. I think this is going to get at those that apply by the deadline, which is a week before the election, and we do have a few of those. It just varies from election to election. So it could be a handful, it could be a lot. It just depends.
Delegate Cole.
Yeah, how would, all right, if you got to basically keep the count open until a few days, before the Department of Elections certifies it, how can the local electoral board certify an election then?
I would imagine that the process would have to be, the local electoral boards would go ahead and do their abstracts and as of the count as of Election Day, and then would have to submit an amended abstract to include whatever UOCAVA ballots that this might have captured.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, so I can report in 2017 in the race for the 28th district to replace outgoing Speaker Howell, there were 55 UOCAVA ballots that arrived on Wednesday morning after the polls closed. It will be different by district, even if you're in a heavily military district like Newport News. A lot of those active duty are actually registered in Florida or Texas as their primary residence. So it's going to go from maybe a couple hundred at the highest level who are going to request a ballot and return it to just a couple dozen. It's really hard to tell because of where their residence is, and then they have to request the UOCAVA ballot and before the election.
Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question or speak to it?
I do have one more point.
Okay. Go.
I have personal concern about the language on line 32 of the bill, where it talks about other postal stamp, and I'm wondering if this would allow the Pitney Bowes type stamp to be used, which the person can manually set the date of the postmark. I would suggest alternate language saying other governmental postmark or commercial courier to prevent that.
Delegate
Sorry,
Tran?
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
So just to clarify, I think lines 31 and 32 is that a postmark shall include any official? So it's not, were you concerned about the postmark or the postage?
Postmark.
Okay.
As it reads, it could be interpreted to mean a Pitney Bowes type postmark that the voter can manually put on the return ballot. And that's more of a technical nature.
Delegate Bloxham. There's been no amendment made. No.
Mr. Chairman,
Delegate Price.
I have a motion.
Go
I
ahead.
move that we go by for the day.
There's been a motion to go by for the day. Is there a second? Second. There's been a motion to pass by for the day House Bill 203. And there's been a second. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. All right, House Bill 203 has gone by for the day. Delegate Sickles. Delegate Sickles, you have 4 bills, so why don't you pick your poison?
Mr. Chairman, on Bill number 242, emergency voting, I would request that we go by for the day on that.
Okay, Delegate Sickles requests that House Bill 242 go by for the day.
Speak to that motion.
Delegate Sickles, you may speak to that motion.
I would I understand that the registrars might have an issue with this bill, and so nobody came to see me about it, but this is an invitation to come see me about it so we can get the language right.
Is there a second on that motion?
Second.
There's been a motion and a second. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. All right, House Bill 242 is by for the day. Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next 2 bills are all about, I guess, the Postal Service, and I think we all can agree the Postal Service may not have the same standards that it once had when we were children with their prompt delivery. And the first bill, HB 240, Mr. Chairman, would actually back up. This issue came up in one of the recent person who was talking. Back up the deadline to request an absentee ballot by a few days, so that people who are requesting an absentee ballot by mail. Yep, that's right. So the people who are requesting an absentee ballot can have assurance that it will get there and they will have time to return it. That's not right? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, okay. I've got so much good legislation here. Okay. Started talking about the wrong bill. Sorry. The annual application is for people who would like to, at the beginning of the year, request an absentee ballot for every election that's going to happen just in that year. So right now, the code requires that you can only do this if you have a disability or illness, and it's the only excuse of the absentee ballot, excuses or reasons to request an absentee ballot that requires a note from the doctor. And so this would strike that sickness and allow people to have be automatically sent an absentee voting for every election that they're eligible for in that calendar year. So it would be the primary in March, the town election in May, the primary in June, and the general election in November. So they would be able to do that in one application. So that's what the bill does. It's pretty simple. It's just to help people who know they can't go to a poll for any election day and want to just, it's a service to the voter to be able to have that for that entire year's worth elections, and helps them to not forget an election. So that's what the bill does. It's very simple, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions from members of the committee? Is there anybody that would like to speak in favor of the bill?
Good morning again. Kirk Showalter, General Registrar for the City of Richmond, speaking on behalf of the Voter Registrars Association. We are very much supportive of this bill and thank Delegate Sickles, especially with no excuse absentee voting. This will make our workload much more predictable for through-the-mail voting. We'll know out the gate exactly how many people have already applied and whose ballots will have to go out the first day. So we do support that, either the annual, or I think that there is another bill that would allow for permanent absentee application.
But that's not this bill.
No, sir. And I apologize on the other bill, but we just discovered that yesterday, so we will be calling you, sir.
Lisa Stye, Virginia Education Association, and we support the bill.
Anybody opposed to the bill?
Move to report, Mr. Chairman.
There's been a move to report and a second. House Bill 240. All those in favor will vote aye. Clerk may close the roll. That bill passes 6-0. Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to get on the right bill this time. So if we could turn to HB 239. This is what I was speaking to a minute ago, the deadline for requesting an absentee ballot. And that is because the deadline is kind of short. We want to make sure the time, right now, if you waited till the last day, it might be difficult for the Postal Service, for the registrar to get you the ballot and the ballot be returned in the mail in time for Election Day. So it moves back the deadline from, where's to move it back from? It's a 10-day, 7 to 11 days in advance. And this bill is kind of in combination with the next bill, which we passed out of here last year that the Senate didn't like, that uses the postmark as the indicia for, but that's another bill. This bill just says, extends the deadline for a voter to apply for an absentee ballot that is to be cast by mail from the 7th day prior to the election to the 11th day prior to the election. That's all it does.
Are there any committee members that have a question?
We got 4 votes.
Is there anybody that would like to speak in favor of the bill?
Barbara Tabb, the Electoral Board Association, we do support this bill, and thank you for putting this in. We do appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Kirk Showalter speaking on behalf of the voter registrars. We really appreciate this bill. Sometimes the registrars feel like Linus and Lucy in the football with the post office. A number of years ago, the the deadline for applying for an absentee ballot was Thursday before the election. Post office changed its delivery service. We ran into the problems of voters not getting their ballots on time. So the General Assembly, thank you very much, moved the deadline back to Tuesday. Well, now the post office is again changing its service, so we're asking for a couple more days to make sure that the ballot can transit out and get back to us. So thank you for this bill.
Chairman, members of the committee, Robin Lynn, speaking on behalf of the Gibson County Electoral Board, and also as a member of the GREB work group, which tried to do a study of this particular problem of the mail going out and coming back. And across the state, the post office sends out the mail to other states for regional sectional centers. Some parts of Northern Virginia go to West Virginia. Some parts of Southwest Virginia go to North Carolina. In my particular case in Goochland County, our mail goes from Goochland Courthouse to the sorting center, which is at the airport in Richmond, and then comes back again. We have had excessive delays in that sorting center for reasons I'm not competent to explain. But this will help us so that voters don't feel that they've been defrauded by asking for a ballot, getting it back, and not having it counted because it came in afterwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is anybody?
Lisa Steib, VEA supports this bill as well.
Is anybody that would like to speak in opposition to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have a comment and a motion.
Delegate Price.
I would like to thank all of the registrars for their hard work, and I would also like to thank all of our USPS postal workers for all of their hard work, and not as a commentary on the quality of their work, but the reality of the time that it takes, I do move that this bill be reported.
There's been a motion and a second to report House Bill 239. Members will record their vote on the electronic voting system. Clerk can close the roll. That bill reports 6-0. Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn to my last bill, HB 238, and I would like to associate myself with remarks about our letter carriers in Postal Service. They are good friends, and the internet has been really bad for their business model. So, they're trying to do more with less. But Delegate Krizak's trying to help. This bill we passed out of here last year, and it has to do with most people might think, or a lot of people might think, if they put their absentee ballot in the mail on Saturday, it would get to the registrar's office before 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the election day, and I think that's probably not a good bet in the world we live in, despite all the very good people working in the Postal Service. And all this does, as it did last year, is move the deadline to, with you have a postmark on the absentee ballot, to the provisional ballot return time, which is noon on that Friday, unless there is a holiday. So right now we have a deadline to anyone who's cast a provisional ballot to bring in their proof of identification or where they live or whatever the issue was by noon on Friday, and it would extend to that date. I think it would, the registrars can comment on this if they'd like, but there is a rush to the post office. They have to trust that this is the mail that's come in by 7 p.m. So it takes that possibly frenetic activity at the end of the day on election day and gives you 2.5 more days to get that properly cast ballot to be counted. That's the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Any committee members have questions? In the name of being conscious of our time and having a couple bills left and the vote last year, if you just support this bill, if you could raise your hand. If you're opposed, thank you. We work on motions.
Move to report, Mr. Chairman.
There's been a motion and a second to report House Bill 238. Members will record their vote on the electronic voting system. Clerk can close the roll. That bill reports 6-0. We have 2 bills left on the docket. Chairman Lindsay.
My request would be that you table HB 18.
All right, Chairman Lindsay moves that we table House Bill 18. Is there a second? So moved. The motion is to table House Bill 18. Members will record their vote on the electronic voting system. Clerk may close the roll. That is tabled 6-0. Last up is House Bill 207, which is my bill, which builds on Delegate Sickles' very fine bill and just makes essentially what his bill does permanent, so that there's a permanent absentee voting. You would be able to opt in, and you would get your ballot mailed to you permanently rather than every year. We do have a line amendment, so council, if you could read that amendment, pass that amendment out. So if everybody's had time to read, it's line 354. Strike of and insert the voter moves to a different address not in the same county or city of his registration or.
I move the amendments, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second? Second. The amendment has been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That amendment passes. And I would also like to request a second amendment of a delayed enactment of 1 year. So if the clerk could, or the council could address that.
So what we'll do is at the end of line 550, beginning on a new line 551, we'll insert an enactment clause that says that the provisions of this act shall become effective July 1st, 2021. Okay.
All those in favor of moving the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. That amendment passes. And so this bill just extends what Delegate Sickles' bill does, provides permanent absentee voter list. Are there any questions? Delegate Cole.
Yeah, I understand what you're wanting to do. However, I'm afraid this is going to end up creating another never-ending list. Right now, when you use the voter list, you go out door knocking. It's not unusual to go to a house that may have, 7 or 8 different registered voters at that house that no longer live there because that list is never really purged or very rarely. It's very difficult to purge the voter list. And I'm afraid we're going to be doing the same thing with this permanent absentee voter list, is that people are going to move, and so forth, and you're going to end up with a permanent list of absentee voters that the registrar won't be informed of their moving or whatever. And I'm afraid it's just going to create another, inaccurate list.
Delegate Cole, then you should like my fine bill because it creates a non-forwardable letter so that it actually helps keep the rolls fresher. If somebody has moved, it gets bounced back to the registrar and they can remove them for the roll. So this actually helps keep the rolls more fresh, not less.
So, as a former ranking member of this committee, I'm going to take over this process here. Is there anybody to speak for or against this permanent absentee ballot proposal from the mini chairman?
Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Scoville from Unite Virginia speaking in support of the bill. We believe it increases voter turnout, at the same time reducing administration and the workload of the registrar's office, saving an estimated 8,000 hours of local registrar staff hours that are spent processing repeat absentee voters, and ask that you support this bill. Thank you.
Do any of the committee members have any more questions of the patron?
Move to report, Mr. Chairman.
There's been a motion and a second. I would ask the motion is to report with amendments, and the committee will vote on the electronic voting device. Thank you. The HB 207 passes on a vote of 4-2.
And with that, we've concluded our business. Is there a motion to adjourn? Second. There's been a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Meeting is adjourned.